張り切っていこう。
It's basically obvious on what I'm supposed to be doing here. So, we're back for more of this little headcanon rambling series that I've been doing since like July of 2023. And like I stated around January, I'm about to end the series around July with the 19th entry, just in time for its 3rd anniversary. And seeing that this is the 17th entry of this series that I've been doing, I guess it kind of feels like that I'm almost there to the end of this little series as a bit of a grand finale. Now, there is a part of me that wants to expand the entirety of my own little headcanon of the Island of Soda and whatnot, but I feel like it's probably gonna be a bit too much since it'll probably be all over the place, so many retcons would be happening, and basically like everything else would just be a mess. Which is why I don't want to expand it to the point where it's just basically too much. So yeah, and with all that said, let's just start this 17th entry of my own little headcanon. Shall we? Number 1. The Midland Railway 1000 class was a fleet of 440 type steam locomotives that were built between 1902 and 1909 and were rebuilt between 1913 and 1928 for operations across the Midland Railway and later the LMS. They would operate for both the Midland and later LMS until the withdrawals beginning around 1948, where by 1953, all of them had been cut up with the likely exception of one, which is now under the ownership of the National Collection, that being the prototype engine of the 1000 class, which is numbered 1000. Midland Railway 1000 class number 1025 was built sometime during the early 1900s and was allocated at St. Pancras to pull express trains out of London St. Pancras towards Bradford, Leeds, York, Manchester, and Carlisle, with the mini locomotive even operating along the cross-country route between Bristol, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, and York. But unfortunately, by 1948, the engine was withdrawn from service and was soon placed into storage around the Derby Works. Fortunately for the engine, it was acquired by the Northwestern region for operations around Edwards branch line on passenger trains that would have operated outside of Brendam towards Wellsworth and or the main station. 1025 was later given the name of Baldwin, which was named after the Baldwin Locomotive Works around Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, while Midland Railway 1000 would be preserved and would be owned by the National Collection. With Baldwin now being under the hands of the Northwestern region, for most of his life he would wear his British Railway colours until the 1960s when it was repainted into his original Midland Railway style colourings with LMS font letterings all around him. And after his visit to a heritage railway around the 1980s, alongside another engine to attend, he is still operational with us along the Northwestern Railway, as his compound-like design can make him a really useful engine for operating express services along the Island of Sodor, as he is still used on that type of service along Edwards branch line to this very day. Number 2. The Dunstable Heritage Center around the 1980s had held a summer gala event where steam locomotives and diesel locomotives would attend the Bute Street at around Luton to attend the event. Many of the other engines that were visiting from other heritage railways or mainline operating railways would attend this gala event at around Bute Street, with even some Surgeon residents even coming along for this trip as well. Those including Connor and Caitlin, in which in my headcanon, are both Great Western Railway Castle classes, which were numbered 7034 and 7035, and see in Ogmere Castle, a LNWR special type tank engine, in which my headcanon was named Sony, and was purchased by the NWR from its private owner during some time during the early 1980s. And an N2 tank engine which was named Ryan, who was visiting the Dunstable Heritage Center, who, before being acquired by the NWR, had operated along this line for a little while before his withdrawal. And having been reunited to operate on his stomping grounds at the Heritage Center, he couldn't be even more happier to operate along this part of the line that he had operated before his withdrawal in the 1960s. The summer event for the Dunstable Heritage Center was a massive success, as many of the engines had operated special trains across this part of the line, as well as recreating some events that have occurred during the line's operational history, with even an engine that was recently acquired by the National Collection even revisiting this part of the line, that being LNER J13 number 8846, in which in this case, it was numbered 1246 and was seen recreating the road tour that it had with the Dunstable Railway line in the 1960s. As well as this, diesel road tours would also be attended at the Heritage Center, as, after the event was over, most of the engines would soon return back to their original owners, as well as a few surgery-involved engines. And as of today, the Dunstable Heritage Center would continue to offer these summer events, with the recent one actually happening around 2025, with the next one set to happen within 2026, as well as other gala events for the Dunstable Heritage Center to attend and host for the foreseeable future. Number 3. Crovan's Gate was a historical significance for the railways of Sodor, as the Sodor and Mainland Railway had connected it to its Vickerstown, and during the early 2000s, Crovan's Gate had decided to create a railway museum, and with the help of some investors, including the Vickerstown Railway Museum, they were able to create the Crovan's Gate Preservation Society. And a few years later, in 2008, Crovan's Gate would welcome the Crovan's Gate Heritage Center and/or the Crovan's Gate Railway Museum. The museum will boast a variety of rolling stock and its modern architecture, as the Heritage Center would be constructed from the same materials that will be used around the Locomotion Museum around Shildon. Its entree of rolling stock and locomotives cannot be understated, as the museum was under the hands of a joint ownership between the Crovan's Gate Preservation Society and the Vickerstown Railway Museum, which was under an umbrella organization under the Surgery Science and Technology Group of the island of Sodor. The Railway Museum at Crovan's Gate would also boast a variety of operational rolling stock, as well as celebrating the events that have occurred during the island of Sodor's railway's history, in which some of its most iconic ones being a Nielsen box tank, which was preserved by the Crovan's Gate Mining Company, which was named O'Neill, an ex-Mid-Sodor railway-built mining engine, which was built by the Découville Works around France, and a Kirsch Stewart 040 well tank, which was named Albury, which was once a part of the Northwestern Railway, but is now preserved under the Crovan's Gate Heritage Center under the Crovan's Gate Preservation Society, and is seen operating alongside Neil on a demonstration line across the museum. As of today, the Crovan's Gate Heritage Center and/or the Crovan's Gate Railway Museum is now considered the most iconic building to ever be represented around Crovan's Gate, and will remain as such even to this very day. Number 4. The Great Western Railway 9400s were a fleet of 210 060 pannier tank designs that were built by several different manufacturers between 1947 and 1956 for operations across the Great Western Railway and later western regions of British Railways. They would operate as shunting locomotives as well as banking locomotives across the Western Region system until the withdrawals around the 1960s, where most of them had been withdrawn from service, aside from the two that are now preserved with us to this day, that being the prototype engine of the 9400s and 9466. GWR 9400 class number 8436 was built sometime during the 1950s and was soon sent to station piloting work across London's Paddington. During some time in the 1960s, before he was withdrawn from service, he would be seen outside at Paddington Station pulling goods trains bound for Reading, Bristol and/or Oxford, while also pulling passenger trains from time to time to fill in for the suburban traffic for most of the engines working at Old Oak Common. After his withdrawal from service in December of 1965, he was swiftly purchased by the Northwestern Railway for operations as a station pilot of Tidmouth after Duck had left to work on his branch line. After arriving at Tidmouth, it would soon perform its duties as the station pilot, shunting coaches and trucks all across the yards and performing well per usual for a station pilot. and would continue to do so until the 1990s, when the 9400 was soon replaced by a fleet of ex-British Railways Class 11 diesel locomotives, which were from the National Coal Board and were soon given the name of Splatter and Dodge, and which soon took over the work of the 9400s across the yards and docklands of the Teignmouth area. As of today, the 9400 is still operational with us to this day, as it can now be seen along the Little Western, pulling passengers and goods trains across the branch line, and will continue to do so even to this very day. Number 5. The GWR 1500 classes were fleets of 060 pannier tank engines that were built in 1949 and were used across the western region of British Railways. Although they were operational across the western region of British Railways, they mainly performed station piloting duties across Paddington. But withdrawals began around 1959, with the last one being withdrawn in 1963, and 3 of them were soon sold to the National Coal Board. Whereas for today, only one member of the class survives in the preservation, that being GWR 1500 class number 1501. British Railways / Great Western Railway 1500 class number 1504 was built sometime in 1949 for station piloting duties across Paddington and would be placed into operations at around Odock Common, but by 1963, the engine was withdrawn from service and was soon placed into storage. After its withdrawal from service, it was originally meant to be sent to the National Coal Board alongside 3 other engines, but this was cancelled and was soon placed into storage, before swiftly being purchased by the North Western Railway for operations across Sodor, mainly within the dockland areas around Teignmouth, which was becoming overloaded with many goods being shipped in and out of the island. After being purchased by the Northwestern region, it was soon sent over to Teignmouth for operations across the docklands, shunting trains in and out of the port and into the yards of Teignmouth, where the 1500 would continue to operate until the early 2010s, when the 1500 was soon replaced by a fleet of British Railways Class 08s to take over the operations across Teignmouth, with the both of them being former EWS shunters. Although the 1500 doesn't operate across the yards and docklands of the Teignmouth area, it is still operational around the Little Western, as it was reallocated towards Allsborough to shunt passengers, goods, and even fish trains from time to time, with even the engine being seen pulling short-distance goods trains between Allsborough and Callan. And as of today, the 1500 is still operational with us to this very day along the Little Western branch line. Number 6. Speaking of the British Railways Class 08s at Teignmouth, Paxton and Sydney, in my headcanon, are still based on the British Railways Class 08, which are a fleet of diesel shunters that were built between the 1950s and 60s for use across the yards and stations across the British Railways network. Both Paxton and Sydney were built within the same year, as is with the rest of the British Railways diesel locomotives, and were soon placed into operations and were soon placed into service across different regions across the British Railways system, with Paxton being on the southern region and Sydney being on the eastern region of British Railways. Their operating careers with British Railways would largely remain uneventful for the 2 diesels, as they would be seen operating across the freight yards around the southern and eastern regions of British Railways, and even into the sectorization days of British Railways, as the 2 would meet up around a freight yard across the Midland region of British Railways, where the 2 of them would be commencing into operations with that said freight sector, and it would continue to do so until the privatization days of British Railways, where the 2 diesels would end up into the ownership of different companies before landing into the hands on the EWS's railway system throughout the early 2000s. Now under new ownership, both Sydney and Paxton would operate for the English, Welsh, and Scottish Railway, and even into the days of DB Shanker until the withdrawal sometime during the early 2010s, where the 2 diesels would be placed into storage, awaiting their inevitable fate of being scrapped. Fortunately for the 2 diesels, they were both purchased by the Northwestern Railway, and after their overhauls at the Crovens Gate Works, Sydney would be restored to operating condition. However, during some time, his old wheels would have to be replaced with a new one, which was spared from a scrapped British Railways Class 08 from Freightliner. And ever since then, he would be used as the new station pilot at Titmuth, and would still be used as such to this very day. As for Paxton, after hanging out at the diesel works and temporarily working for the Blue Mountain Quarry, he is now used as the station pilot of Titmuth, also operating across the yards and dockland areas around Titmuth, with Sydney, as of now, being operational with us to this very day along the Northwestern Railway, as the two diesels would continue on shunting across the yards of Titmuth, as well as attending duties as the station pilot. Number 7. Parcels trains, alongside the mail trains, were a key factor during the introduction of the railway age in the 1800s. It would soon become popular with many of the railway companies operating these parcel services all the way up towards the early 2000s, where most of them have been withdrawn from service and were soon discontinued alongside the mail trains that have been running since the 1830s. While most railways in Great Britain were introducing their parcel services during the inception of the railway age, the island of Sodor would of course be a part of this trend as well, as they would introduce their very own parcel services, with the Sodor Mainland Railway introducing a non-stop parcel train from Vickerstown bound for Kirk Ronan. It would soon expand towards the entirety of the island by the time of the 1880s. Many of these parcel services that are running along the island would use a variety of rolling stock that were loaned out from other railway companies or built in-house to operate across the island and or the mainland. Even into the days of the Northwestern Railway, the parcel trains would continue to operate, with the Big Four railway companies even jointly operating a service with the Northwestern Railway. And with the nationalization of the entirety of the British Railway network, the parcel trains would continue on operating even into the days of the dieselization era in the 1960s. Although most of the region that is located within the UK had dieselized their parcel train services, the island of Sodor will remain as the only one to operate both steam and diesel-hauled parcel services even into the 1970s, where most of the parcel services were handled by diesel locomotives and the electric locomotives operating across the mainland. It was also during this time where British Railways began to unify most of the parcel services that were operating across the network under one single brand, and this brand was later known as the Red Star Parcel Services, which was formed in 1963 to deliver parcels from the major cities from Great Britain to the railway stations that it served to trains that would operate all across the network. But by 1999, all of these services that were operated by Red Star were purchased by Lynx Express, which preferred the roads and airways to deliver their parcels. And so, by the 25th of May, 2001, the last of the parcel trains had ran, as most of the services would unfortunately close up for good, leaving the parcel train operations to be extinct by the next day. Although the Northwestern Railway would also discontinue their parcel services at the same time, around the 25th of May of that same year, the legacy of the parcel services that would operate across the mainland and on the island cannot be forgotten, as these services would shape the way for parcel delivery services by rail between the small towns and large cities of the mainland and the island, and their similar stature to that of the post train can never be understated, as these services will continue on as memories by the people that have seen and heard of these services operating across the British Isles, with the parcel trains never being forgotten to this very day. Number 8. The British Railways Class 802 was a fleet of high-speed bi-mode multiple units that were designed by Hitachi for operations across the train operating companies of Great Britain, and they would be constructed between 2017 and 2020, with the first of the 802s entering into service along the Great Western Railway on the 18th of August of 2018. And ever since then, the 802s have been operating around Great Britain ever since, having been a part of the Hitachi's AT300 series of high-speed trains. Between the time period that the 802s have been beginning to enter into service, the Northwestern Railway had decided to buy a few of the Hitachi 802 classes to operate across the island, with a few fleets of 802s arriving around the island for trials around late 2019, where they would be placed into operations along non-electrified and electrified services across the island before later entering into service within the next year. After some time in service, the NWR's fleet of 802 classes would be placed on a new schedule on a non-stop express run between Timoth and London's Euston, which commenced into service around the summer of 2021. At the same time, the modernized Euston Special would begin to operate with a fleet of the 5-car 802 sets, while the Timoth to Euston non-stop run would use a fleet of 9-car units that would also arrive at the same time as the 5-car units that were purchased by the NWR. As of today, the 802 classes are still operational with us to this day, as the Northwestern Railway had operated the IETs as well as the last remaining HSTs, including Pip and Emma, for the variety of passenger services that would have been operated by the NWR, as well as other fleets of the IETs that the Northwestern Railway had purchased, with the IETs and HSTs operating alongside each other ever since. As for the mainland operators of the 802s, they're still around to this day as well, as they have been used across various different operations across the UK, and ever since then, they are still operating with many of the UK railway operators, as they were intended to do since 2018. Number 9. Vickerstown Harbour is located within the west coast of the island, and its operations and services were handled by the Northwestern Railway, with trains coming in and out of the harbour, making this part of the island a key factor within the history of the town itself. The harbour can be traced back to the early days of the Sodor and Mainland Railway, as within the 1860s, the harbour became a key point in connecting passengers towards Barrow and Furness via the Furness Railway, and ever since then, the harbour has been expanded to what it is now, with the only exceptions being the two largest harbours of Timoth and Knapford, and just below it, Crovan's Gate and Brandham, with the harbour at Vickerstown being in third place for the 5 largest harbours within the island. The harbour mainly consists of a container facility that was opened in the 1960s to handle container trains coming in and out of the facility, a tramway road which actually leads into one of the piers, and was opened during the early days of the harbour, where passengers and goods trains would drop off their loads around that said pier, and the harbour would see a connection of a tramway which was operated by the Vickerstown Tramway Company. As the years went on, the harbour began to expand and so delved into the variety of general goods services that the harbour mainly serves, with even some new things being added to the harbour that later became mandatory for all harbours within the island. An engine shed is located just near to the harbour, which is also connected to one of the largest marshalling yards that the town has ever seen, that being the Vickerstown Marshalling Yards, that was opened during the golden age of the Northwestern Railway, which soon later became a connection for general goods services traveling along the line that leads into the harbour and the container facility that is located within the harbour of Vickerstown. Although the marshalling yards had received a bit of modernization in the 1960s to be more up-top with the British Railway standards of marshalling yards, and later rationalization in the 1980s, which could have easily shut down the entirety of the marshalling yards if it wasn't for a council meeting that actually saved the entirety of the marshalling yards from closure by British Railways. But as of today, the marshalling yards is still operational with us to this very day, having now being operated by the Northwestern Railway and its subsidiary company that also operates outside of Vickerstown. Although the engine sheds around the Vickerstown harbour had seen some changes throughout its history, the engine sheds around the harbour had since been closed and was soon demolished, with only a coaling facility and a water tower remaining as remnants of the old sheds that is located within the harbour. As of today, the operations around the Vickerstown harbour is still intact to this very day, with operations around the container facility as well as the dockyards still being intact, with these operations now being handled by a fleet of diesel shunters that would operate across the harbour and the facility. With a new addition to the harbour being a container facility that was built specifically for direct rail services, and is just located between a section of the main line that is also near to the town of Vickerstown, with the harbour as well as its facilities still being in operations even to this very day. And finally, number 10. When British Railways began to be privatized in the 1990s, several different railroad companies had opted to buy out the fleet of sectorized services that had been operating around British Railways since the 1980s, with some of them being ranged from short-distance commuter operations to long-distance intercity services, as well as other services across Great Britain, with even the freight sector even being used as a part of 3 different companies before later being purchased by Wisconsin Central to form the EWS. Around 1997, after the Northwestern Railway became its own company again, a subsidiary company would be formed, which was later known as the Trainload Freight Distributions Agency, which was formed to handle the goods services across the island and on the mainland, and would use a fleet of vintage-built diesel locomotives that were built by British Railways in the 1960s that would operate across the UK and on the island for operations on freight traffic across the British Isles. Many of these vintage diesel locomotives would later be supplemented by the fleets of Class 58s and Class 60s that were purchased from the English, Welsh, and Scottish Railway for operations across the island and on the mainland, alongside the vintage rolling stock of the diesel and electric fleets from the 1960s and 1970s. During the early 2000s, the distributions agency would carry out goods services as well as the occasional road tours for the summer months, but would occasionally do goods work to hand out with the loads from the Northwestern Railway, which would handle the heritage services that would also operate across the island and on the mainland. Despite this, however, the fleet of Class 60s that the Northwestern Railway had acquired, as well as those that have been operated by Trainload Freight, would work splendidly alongside the fleet of vintage-built diesel locomotives. And during the mid to late 2000s to the early 2010s, an overhaul of these vintage fleet of diesels would begin to be commenced for operations around that decade and for many years to come, with the overhaul being completed sometime around early 2014, when the last fleet of the Class 31s that Trainload Freight had acquired would be restored into operating condition to operate goods and rail tour services for the agency. Electric locomotives would also be overhauled as well, but most of them would be operated by a fleet of diesel locomotives that have been operating around the island and those that have been acquired by the English, Welsh, and Scottish Railway. And as of today, the agency is now proud to be a part of the Northwestern Railway as a subsidiary company operating goods services across the British Isles. And even if they would operate even into the renationalization era, their legacy within their operations can still be held to this very day. Even with a fleet of Class 66s to call home, they would continue to operate a fleet of vintage-built diesel locomotives, and even into the 2030s, they would still operate them to this very day. Well, that's another video done, and we're already at the end of the video anyway. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this 17th entry of my headcanon rambling series, or this AOLO rambling series, or whatever that I like to call. I mean, we still got like one more to go before I end off this series with a finale of some sorts of this little series that I've been doing since July 2023 for its 3rd anniversary. You know how much I would have honestly tried to actually finish off a series that I've been doing that has been long running. But I guess things just happen. In some circumstances, we just really need to end things off in the way that I just feel like it would be more memorable to do so. And well, that's basically it, I guess. So the next entry will be releasing around May, which is the 18th entry of this little series. And after this, it's basically what you know, which will be releasing around July. So yeah, I'll be seeing you guys on the 18th entry around May. Bye bye!